The millionaire invited his maid as a joke, but when she arrived like a goddess, everyone stared. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Alexander Reed had built his fortune before most people figured out what they wanted to do with their lives. At 38, he owned a glass and steel empire overlooking Manhattan, measured success in quarterly gains, and trusted numbers more than people. His penthouse moved on quiet efficiency, and so did the woman who cleaned it. Claire Donovan arrived every morning at 8 sharp, hair neatly pulled back, eyes alert, movements precise. Alexander barely noticed her, except when something was out of place. That distance was comfortable for him. People stayed in their lanes. One afternoon, his assistant canceled last minute. The annual Winterlight Gala was that evening, a room full of donors, rivals, cameras, and judgment, and Alexander disliked appearing alone. He scanned his calendar, frowned, then glanced toward the kitchen where Claire was wiping the counter, sleeves rolled, expression neutral. The idea surfaced casually, almost lazily, the way careless thoughts do when power feels weightless. He stepped closer and said her name like it was a task, not a person. He told her there was a gala, that he needed a +1, that it would be simple. His tone suggested a favor, but his eyes carried a hint of amusement he didn't bother to hide. It was meant as a harmless joke to him, an experiment in contrast, a reminder of who belonged where. Claire paused, cloth still in her hand. She had learned the language of rooms without being invited to speak. She heard the subtext immediately. She also heard something else, a challenge she didn't ask for, but understood all the same. She asked one question, calm and steady, asking if he was serious. Alexander nodded, already moving on, already certain of the outcome. He offered to have a dress delivered, transportation arranged, details handled. He assumed gratitude would follow. Claire didn't smile. She said yes anyway, not because she believed in fairy tales, and not because she needed the money. She said yes because she believed in dignity, and because sometimes the only way to be seen was to step into the light others thought you couldn't handle. That evening, alone in her small apartment measured in square feet rather than floors, Claire laid out a navy dress she had owned for years, carefully altered by her own hands, and placed a simple necklace on the dresser, the kind of heirloom that carried memory rather than sparkle. She stood in front of the mirror and lifted her chin. She didn't rehearse lines or imagine applause. She reminded herself of one truth she had carried quietly for a long time. She did not need permission to exist with confidence. Across town, Alexander adjusted his cufflinks, certain the night would proceed exactly as planned, unaware that the joke he set in motion was about to turn into a test he never prepared for. Claire arrived at the penthouse earlier than usual that evening, not because she was nervous, but because she refused to be rushed. The city outside the windows glowed in winter amber, traffic moving like a living current far below, measured in miles per hour and patience. She finished her work methodically, wiping surfaces Alexander never noticed unless something was wrong, aligning objects that spoke of a life built on control. Alexander, meanwhile, moved through his bedroom with efficient distraction, checking messages, reviewing donor names, scanning talking points. He treated the gala like a transaction, a room where reputation was currency and presence mattered more than warmth. When he glanced at the time, he assumed Claire would appear in whatever had been arranged, grateful, quiet, invisible. Instead, she knocked once, stepped inside without hesitation, and paused just long enough to meet her own reflection in the mirror near the door. She wore the navy dress she had altered herself, fabric falling cleanly, not loudly, her posture steady. The necklace rested at her collarbone, simple, personal, unseen by anyone else but her. Alexander turned and registered a difference he could not immediately categorize. Not beauty in the way magazines defined it, but composure, the kind that did not ask permission. He masked the flicker of surprise with a polite nod and a reminder about timing. The car waited downstairs. Claire acknowledged him, with a brief smile that did not seek approval. The elevator ride was silent, the kind of silence that stretches seconds into something heavier. Alexander checked his phone. Claire watched the numbers descend, grounding herself. Outside, the driver opened the door, and the city air pressed cold and sharp against their faces. As they pulled into traffic, Alexander explained the basics: names, expectations, the unspoken rules of standing beside him. Claire listened without interruption, absorbing the instructions the way she absorbed everything else, carefully, selectively. She did not promise anything. She simply said she understood. The venue rose ahead, a restored landmark with columns washed in light, security moving guests through with practiced ease. Cameras hovered at the edge, lenses catching coats, smiles, status. Alexander straightened, readying the version of himself the room demanded. He stepped out first, offering an arm out of habit more than intention. Claire accepted, not clinging, not shrinking. Her pace matched to his. The first murmurs followed almost immediately, not loud enough to name, but present, like static. Faces turned. Eyes assessed. Alexander felt it, and told himself it was nothing. That novelty always drew attention. Inside, the air carried the sound of conversation layered with music, glasses chiming, heels tapping against polished stone. They moved through the entrance as a unit, and with each step, the whispers gained shape. Claire did not rush. She did not slow. She met glances with calm acknowledgement, the way someone does when they know who they are regardless of where they stand. A familiar donor approached Alexander, greeting him warmly before letting curiosity slip into his gaze. Alexander introduced Claire with her name, nothing more. The donor nodded, surprised, then smiled, recalibrating. Across the room, a few heads tilted. A few conversations stalled. Alexander felt the room's attention land and realized he was no longer directing it. The joke he thought he was carrying lightly had weight now, measured in looks and silence. Claire felt it too, but she had lived under scrutiny of a different kind her entire life. She knew how to breathe through it, how to remain present without performance. As servers passed with trays, as music swelled, as the evening unfolded, something shifted subtly but decisively. Alexander, who had always owned rooms by design, found himself reacting instead of leading, aware that standing beside Claire was changing the calculus. He told himself it was temporary, that control would return. He did not yet understand that the test had already begun, and that the outcome would not be decided by applause or approval, but by the choices he would make next. Back inside the ballroom, the night pressed forward with its own rhythm, and Claire felt the subtle shift as attention settled on her without permission. She stayed close to Alexander but not dependent on him, her presence calm, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady. When introductions came, she responded with courtesy, not charm, answering questions directly, never volunteering more than was asked. Some guests smiled politely and moved on. Others lingered, recalculating, their eyes flicking between her and Alexander as if searching for a script that no longer applied. Alexander noticed the pattern too, the way conversations adjusted when Claire spoke, the way a few people leaned in rather than away. He told himself it was the novelty, the surprise of contrast, but the explanation felt thin. At a cocktail table near the windows, a woman in a tailored gown offered a measured smile and asked Claire where she was from. Claire answered with the name of her neighborhood, not dressed up, not diminished. The woman blinked, then nodded, unsure how to respond, and excused herself. Alexander felt a brief sting of discomfort he could not name. He had brought Claire into this space assuming she would be overwhelmed, that the night would skim past her without consequence. Instead, she moved through it with the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly where her feet were planted. When a server passed with a tray, Claire stepped aside instinctively, a habit formed over years of being in the background. Alexander caught it, a small motion that spoke volumes, and for the first time that evening he wondered what it cost her to stand here. Music swelled and softened. A donor approached Alexander with a practiced smile and a question about next quarter projections. Alexander answered automatically, but his attention drifted. Claire was listening, absorbing cadence and intent, not the numbers themselves. She watched faces, posture, pauses, the way power announced itself quietly. Later, near a display honoring the foundation beneficiaries, a young professional commented on Claire's necklace, calling it tasteful. Claire thanked her and said it belonged to her mother. The word mother landed with gentle gravity. Alexander registered it and felt something settle, a reminder that lives existed beyond the frames he controlled. Time moved in measured increments, minutes marked by glasses refilled and hands shaken. The whispers did not fade, they refined. People stopped asking who Claire was and started asking how Alexander knew her. He answered with variations of the truth that omitted the parts he did not want to examine. He felt the pressure build, not from accusation, but from expectation. The room was testing him now, waiting to see how he would define the woman at his side. Claire sensed it too. She had been tested her whole life, though never like this. She knew when eyes hardened and when curiosity softened. She chose not to perform. Instead, she grounded herself in small truths, the weight of the necklace, the fit of the dress she had altered inch by inch, the memory of her mother's voice reminding her to stand tall. When Alexander excused himself briefly to take a call, Claire remained alone near the windows, the city stretching below in lights and distance measured in blocks and bridges. A guest approached with a polite question that edged toward condescension, asking if she was enjoying her first gala. Claire met the gaze and answered yes, because it was true, because enjoyment did not require permission. The guest nodded, surprised, and stepped away. When Alexander returned, he found Claire exactly where he left her, composed, unruffled, not waiting to be rescued. The realization landed quietly and refused to leave. He understood then that the preparation for this night had not been about dresses or cars or timing. It had been about resolve. Claire had prepared in silence, not to impress, but to remain herself. And in doing so, she had placed the weight of the evening squarely on Alexander, forcing him to confront the difference between inviting someone as a joke and standing beside them with intention. The moment crystallized near the center of the ballroom, where light pooled and attention gathered without invitation, and Claire felt it before she saw it, the quiet intake of breath that moves through a crowd when something unexpected claims the room. She had stepped forward to greet a board member Alexander respected, her posture unforced, her expression composed, and the exchange lasted only seconds, but it sent a ripple outward. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned fully. Someone laughed softly and then stopped. The realization spread that this was not a novelty that would fade with another drink. Claire was here, present, unshrinking, and the room had to account for her. Alexander watched it unfold and felt a tightening behind his ribs, not fear, but recognition. He had invited her into this space assuming the spotlight would swallow her, that the glare would flatten difference. Instead, she redirected it. A photographer lifted a camera, hesitated, then lowered it, uncertain where to aim. The band shifted tempo, a brighter note threading through the air, and servers adjusted their paths, instinctively creating a pocket of space around Claire and Alexander. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A senior partner approached with a question framed as a compliment, remarking on Claire's confidence. Alexander answered before Claire could, saying she had a steady presence. The words surprised him as they left his mouth. They were true, and they committed him in ways he had not anticipated. Claire met his glance briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them, not gratitude, not relief, simply recognition. Nearby, a woman whose influence carried weight tilted her head and offered a cool smile that edged toward appraisal. She asked Alexander how long he and Claire had known each other. The question was precise, designed to place. Alexander felt the room lean in. He could deflect, diminish, or define. He answered with clarity, stating Claire's name and saying she mattered. The silence that followed was brief but dense, measured in heartbeats rather than seconds. Claire felt the shift as well, the air rearranging itself around that choice. She did not soften or perform. She remained as she was, shoulders back, gaze steady, allowing the room to adjust to her rather than the other way around. A donor nearby nodded once, approvingly, then moved on. The whispers recalibrated into something else, less dismissive, more curious. Alexander realized that this was the point of no return, that the evening had crossed from spectacle into judgment. He caught fragments of conversation, a remark about courage, a question about values, a recalculation of alliances. It was happening faster than he expected, the tempo accelerating as attention concentrated. Claire noticed the acceleration too, the way people tested proximity, stepping closer, then back, reading cues. She grounded herself in small details, the smoothness of the necklace, the fit of the dress at her waist, the memory of her mother's hands guiding hers years ago, teaching her how to sew a hem straight and how to hold her chin level. When a guest made a pointed comment about backgrounds, Claire answered with calm honesty, naming her work without apology. The guest faltered, smiled, and retreated. Alexander felt a swell of respect that unsettled him because it demanded response. He could no longer pretend this was harmless. The joke had evaporated, replaced by a test unfolding in real time, a public measure of who he chose to stand with when convenience gave way to consequence. As the evening pressed on, applause rose for a brief announcement, and Alexander and Claire stood together amid the sound, the lights catching the navy of her dress and the silver of her necklace. In that brightness, Alexander understood that the room was no longer asking who Claire was. It was asking who he was, and whether he would match the composure beside him with integrity of his own. The room settled into a different temperature after the applause faded, not warmer or colder, but charged, as if every conversation now carried an extra layer of meaning. Claire felt it in the way people approached with careful timing, waiting for openings that did not require her to yield ground. The whispers no longer asked who she was. They asked what she represented. Alexander stood beside her, aware that the evening had slipped beyond choreography into consequence. A group near the bar angled their bodies toward them, voices low, eyes alert. Someone remarked on confidence as if it were an accessory. Another questioned pedigree with a smile meant to soften the edge. Claire answered with courtesy and restraint, offering no performance, refusing the invitation to justify her presence. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was with precision that surprised those expecting uncertainty. Alexander noticed the economy of her words and the way they landed cleanly, without flourish. He noticed too how quickly assumptions collapsed when confronted with calm clarity. A familiar figure approached, a woman whose influence reached across boards and ballots, her tone pleasant but sharpened by calculation. She asked Alexander if the evening had been planned. The question hung between them like a scale waiting for weight. Alexander replied that the evening was unfolding as it should. The woman's gaze slid to Claire, measuring, then back to Alexander, reassessing. She nodded once and moved on, leaving behind a ripple of renewed attention. Claire felt the scrutiny, but did not internalize it. She grounded herself in small constants, the steady beat of the music, the weight of the necklace, the knowledge that she had chosen to be here on her own terms. A man nearby attempted humor that landed flat, and Claire smiled politely, declining to play along. The refusal shifted the energy, and laughter thinned. Alexander felt a tightening in his jaw, the recognition that every interaction now reflected on him as much as on her. He caught fragments of commentary as they passed, words like unexpected and impressive and interesting used as shields to mask recalibration. He understood that the room was negotiating a new story in real time, and that his silence would be read as permission for others to define it. Claire noticed Alexander's attention sharpen, the way his posture adjusted when a line approached. She did not look to him for rescue. She stood as an equal presence, neither shield nor spectacle. When a donor asked directly about her work, Claire answered plainly, describing responsibility, reliability, the satisfaction of leaving a space better than she found it. The donor nodded, thoughtful, and asked a follow-up that acknowledged substance. Alexander watched the exchange and felt a shift that was both unsettling and clarifying. He realized that the room respected coherence more than status, and that Claire embodied it without trying. The whispers evolved into conversations that included her rather than circled her. Invitations were extended cautiously, then more freely. A few glances hardened, but more softened. Alexander sensed a line approaching, the moment when neutrality would no longer suffice. He felt the weight of expectations settle on his shoulders, heavier than any financial decision he had made that year. The joke he once considered harmless now appeared reckless, not because it embarrassed him, but because it underestimated the cost of dismissing someone else's dignity. Claire felt the shift too, the narrowing of distance before a choice. She did not rehearse outcomes. She trusted the preparation she had done in quiet hours, the resolve that did not require validation. As the evening progressed, the tempo quickened, conversations overlapping, attention cycling back to them with increasing frequency. Alexander caught Claire's reflection in the glass and saw steadiness rather than strain. He understood then that the room was no longer the audience. It was the mirror, and what it reflected back depended entirely on whether he would match Claire's composure with a clear, public commitment to stand where he had already chosen to stand. The opportunity came not with drama but with space, a brief opening in the schedule when the band paused and the crowd redistributed, and Alexander suggested they step onto the terrace for air. The doors closed softly behind them, muting the ballroom into a distant hum, the city opening wide in front of them with bridges lit and avenues measured in lanes and headlights. The night was cold enough to sharpen thought. Claire rested her hands lightly on the railing, feeling the metal steady beneath her palms. Alexander stood beside her, not too close, aware that proximity now carried meaning. For a moment neither spoke. The quiet was not awkward. It was deliberate. Alexander broke it first, acknowledging the shift inside, admitting that the evening had not unfolded as he expected. He did not apologize yet. He named the surprise, the way attention had moved, the way the room had changed when Claire entered it. Claire listened without interruption, eyes on the city, breathing slow. She had learned long ago that listening did not equal agreeing. When she spoke, her voice was even. She said she understood rooms and expectations, that she knew how quickly assumptions formed and how rarely they were questioned. She said she had accepted the invitation because she did not want to be reduced to a punchline she never agreed to. Alexander felt the words land with clarity. He asked her if she felt exposed. Claire shook her head and said exposure was not the same as visibility. She had been exposed before, judged without context, but tonight she had chosen visibility. That difference mattered. Alexander nodded, absorbing the distinction. He admitted, carefully, that he had underestimated her, and that the realization unsettled him because it revealed a habit he did not like. The habit of assuming control equaled correctness. Claire turned to face him then, meeting his gaze without challenge or deference. She said dignity was not a performance, and that respect, once withheld, required more than acknowledgement to be restored. The city wind moved between them, carrying the sound of traffic and distance measured in blocks rather than status. Alexander felt the weight of the moment, not as pressure to impress, but as an obligation to choose alignment over comfort. He told her that standing beside her had forced him to confront how easily he had treated people as variables rather than partners. He said he did not want to do that anymore. The words were plain, unpolished, and because of that they held. Claire considered him, not searching for perfection, but for sincerity that would hold under scrutiny. She said intention mattered, but follow-through mattered more, and that she would not trade her self-respect for access to rooms that had not earned her trust. Alexander accepted the boundary without defense. He said he understood that trust would be built, not assumed. Inside, applause rose again, calling them back. Claire asked one question before they returned, asking him how he planned to introduce her next. Alexander answered without hesitation, stating her name and her presence, without qualifiers or caveats. Claire nodded once. When they stepped back into the light, the room took notice, not because of spectacle, but because something had settled between them that did not bend to rumor. Alexander moved with a steadier posture, no longer scanning for approval. Claire walked beside him with the same composure she had carried all evening. In the brief glances they exchanged, there was no romance promised, no narrative sealed, only an agreement to proceed with honesty. The test was not over. It had simply shifted from the eyes of the crowd to the quieter measure of whether words would be matched by action as the night pressed forward. The gala wound down with practiced efficiency, the crowd thinning as goodbyes were exchanged and cars queued at the curb, and Alexander and Claire exited into the cool night, where the city felt closer and less performative. The driver opened the door, and they settled into the back seat, the leather quiet, the partition raised, the glow of streetlights sliding across the windows in measured intervals. For a few blocks, neither spoke. The silence carried weight now, not tension for its own sake, but the kind that asks for truth. Claire broke it first, her voice steady, asking Alexander why he had really invited her. The question did not accuse. It clarified. Alexander inhaled, aware that deflection would cost more than honesty. He admitted that at first he had treated the invitation as convenience, a way to fill a space, without thinking through consequence. He said he had assumed the room would absorb her without challenge, that the night would move on. Claire listened, eyes forward, absorbing cadence rather than content alone. She asked him if he understood how that landed, how a joke framed by power does not feel harmless to the person on the receiving end. Alexander nodded and said he understood now, that seeing the room react had exposed the flaw in his assumption, not because it embarrassed him, but because it revealed a habit of underestimating people who did not match his expectations. Claire turned to face him, the city reflected in her eyes, and said dignity was not restored by recognition alone, that being seen in a ballroom did not erase years of being overlooked in quieter rooms. She said she did not want apologies shaped for comfort. She wanted clarity about what would change when the lights went out and the audience disappeared. Alexander accepted the terms without bargaining. He said change would be visible in decisions, not declarations, and that he would start by naming her contribution accurately, not as an accessory to an evening, but as a professional whose work mattered. Claire considered that, then asked if he was prepared for what that would require, for scrutiny that would not flatter him. Alexander answered that scrutiny was part of leadership he had grown too comfortable avoiding. The car slowed at a red light, the city pausing with them, engines idling, crosswalk numbers counting down. Claire spoke again, saying she had not come to the gala to be elevated, but to remain intact, and that remaining intact meant she would not accept proximity without respect. Alexander said he did not expect acceptance on credit, that he would earn it or live with the consequence of failing to do so. The light changed, and the car moved on, the rhythm returning. When they arrived at the building, the doorman greeted them with a nod that carried new awareness. Alexander held the door without ceremony, allowing Claire to pass at her pace. Inside the elevator, the ascent felt longer than usual, floors ticking upward, the hum steady. Claire said one last thing before the doors opened, stating plainly that whatever followed would be defined by consistency, not spectacle. Alexander agreed. At the penthouse, Claire gathered her coat and necklace, her movements unhurried. Alexander thanked her for the evening, not as a host, but as someone acknowledging another person's time and trust. Claire accepted the thanks and added that trust was not a single decision, but a series of them, and that she would be watching the series, not the headline. She left then, the door closing softly, leaving Alexander alone with the city spread wide beyond the glass. He stood for a moment without moving, the echo of the evening settling into resolve. The confrontation had not broken anything. It had clarified the work ahead, and clarity, he understood, was the beginning of accountability. The days that followed did not arrive with grand announcements or carefully staged gestures, and Claire noticed the change precisely because it was quiet. The building ran the same. The elevators chimed. The city kept its pace measured in blocks and schedules, but Alexander altered the pattern in ways that were difficult to miss if one paid attention. He stopped referring to people as functions and started naming responsibility clearly. He asked questions without assuming answers. He listened longer than was comfortable for him and resisted the impulse to conclude early. Claire observed from her own lane, continuing her work with the same precision she always had, refusing to read meaning into words alone. When Alexander called a meeting with operations, he asked Claire to attend, not as an accessory, but as someone whose insight mattered to the outcome. The room adjusted awkwardly at first, posture shifting, expectations recalibrating. Alexander introduced her by name and role, accurately, without apology or embellishment. Claire spoke when invited, offering practical observations grounded in experience rather than theory. The suggestions landed because they were useful. The meeting ended with tasks assigned and respect earned quietly. Later that week, Alexander followed through on the promise he had made without ceremony. He restructured responsibilities, aligning titles with actual work, ensuring credit matched contribution. When Claire received the update, it came in a straightforward message that named the change and the reason for it. There was no flourish, no framing as favor. Claire read it twice, then once more, not to savor it, but to verify consistency. She acknowledged the message and returned to her day. Alexander did not hover. He understood that trust required space to form. At the end of the week, he found the necklace on the console where Claire had placed it before leaving. The gala, forgotten in the quiet of departure. He did not assume meaning. He asked if he could return it. When she agreed, he handed it back without commentary, recognizing the object as hers, not a symbol for him to claim. Claire accepted it and said thank you, noting the care in how it had been kept. Alexander took that as instruction rather than praise. Over the next month, decisions accumulated, small and visible. Meetings included voices that had previously been filtered out. Feedback loops shortened. When mistakes surfaced, Alexander addressed them without deflection, naming his own when necessary. Claire watched the pattern hold under pressure, which mattered more than any single outcome. One afternoon, Alexander asked for time to speak, not as an employer, but as a person accountable for earlier choices. He acknowledged the invitation to the gala had begun as a lapse in judgment shaped by convenience and power. He said he understood now that repair required consistency rather than spectacle. Claire listened and responded with clarity, stating that redemption was not an erasure of harm, but a commitment to do better when no one was applauding. Alexander agreed. He asked if she would consider collaborating on a project that elevated operational dignity across the company, not as a favor to him, but as work aligned with her values. Claire asked for details, timelines, and authority. Alexander provided them without hedging. She agreed to review the proposal and make a decision on her terms. When she did, it was because the structure matched the intent. The collaboration moved forward with defined boundaries and shared accountability. As weeks turned into a quarter, the results became measurable, not in headlines, but in retention, morale, and clarity of process. Alexander noticed that leadership felt different now, less performative, more exacting. Claire noticed that respect held even when disagreements arose. One evening, as the city dimmed and schedules slowed, Alexander thanked Claire for choosing substance over spectacle and for holding him to the standard he claimed to value. Claire accepted the thanks and added that dignity, once defended, tended to defend others as well. The gesture that mattered most was not the meeting, the title, or the apology. It was the steady alignment of words and actions over time. In that alignment, something durable took shape, not a promise made under lights, but a foundation strong enough to support whatever came. Next, time settled into a steadier rhythm, and the changes that had once felt intentional became habitual, which Claire understood as the truest measure of sincerity. The collaboration matured into a system that held even when neither of them was present to oversee it, and that durability mattered. Alexander noticed that decisions were now easier to defend because they were grounded in principle rather than optics. Claire noticed that her voice carried weight without being amplified, that her presence no longer required explanation. On an early autumn evening, months after the gala, they met again at the terrace, not because it symbolized anything dramatic, but because it offered quiet and air. The city below moved with familiar certainty, lanes measured, lights timed, the hum constant. Alexander spoke first, acknowledging that leadership had changed him, not by softening resolve, but by sharpening responsibility. He said that meeting Claire had exposed a gap between who he believed he was and how he acted when convenience tempted him. He said closing that gap had cost him comfort, but given him clarity. Claire listened and responded with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. She said growth was not proven by words spoken after the fact, but by patterns that held when attention drifted elsewhere. She said those patterns had held. The statement was not praise. It was confirmation. Alexander accepted it as such. He then asked, carefully, whether she would consider building something together beyond the project they shared, not as an escape from difference, but as a commitment to navigate it openly. He did not frame it as rescue or reward. He framed it as choice. Claire considered the request without hurry. She said partnership required equality in voice and consequence, and that affection without respect would erode quickly. Alexander agreed and outlined how decisions would be shared, how boundaries would be honored, how accountability would be mutual. The conversation remained practical because practicality had been their common language from the start. When Claire agreed, it was not with spectacle, but with a nod that carried intention. They left the terrace together, not to announce anything, but to continue their lives with alignment. In the weeks that followed, the city noticed nothing unusual, which Claire appreciated. Their relationship unfolded without secrecy or performance, defined by consistency and choice. Alexander learned to listen without preparing rebuttals. Claire learned that trust could grow without surrendering independence. When challenges arose, they addressed them directly, without triangulation or silence. On the anniversary of the gala, they returned to the venue briefly for a small foundation event. The room felt different, not because of memory, but because the people within it had changed. Introductions were straightforward. Assumptions fell away faster. Claire wore the same necklace, not as a reminder of arrival, but as continuity. Alexander introduced her by name and partnership, without qualifiers. The acknowledgement felt ordinary, which was the point. Later, away from the lights, Alexander reflected that leadership and love had converged on the same lesson, that dignity multiplied when defended and diminished when treated as optional. Claire reflected that choosing to be seen had opened doors, but choosing to remain herself had kept them open. Their story did not conclude with a single moment or declaration. It resolved into a shared practice, repeated daily, grounded in respect and sustained by action. And in that practice, the room no longer mattered, because the measure had moved inward, where integrity held and did not need an audience.